The Indonesian rainforest held its breath as Captain Marcus Steele pressed his back against a moss-covered tree. Rain drummed steadily on the canopy above, masking his movements as he tracked his quarry through the undergrowth. 6 hours of pursuit had led him to this moment, following a group of arms dealers who'd been supplying advanced weapons to local insurgents. His earpiece crackled softly. Thunder 1. Satellite shows weather disturbance incoming. Unusual patterns. The voice of his handler, Lieutenant Hayes, carried a note of confusion that made Steele pause. Define unusual, he whispered, eyes never leaving the clearing ahead where his targets had made camp. Like nothing we've seen before. Electric storms forming perfect geometric. Hayes's voice cut out in a burst of static. Steele's instincts, honed by years with Delta Force, and refined during his exchange posting with the SAS, screamed danger. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as the air around him began to crackle with electricity. Above, the rainforest canopy suddenly illuminated with brilliant purple light. The arms dealers noticed it too. Through his scope, Steele watched them abandon their careful operational security, pointing skyward and shouting in panic. He couldn't blame them. The clouds above had begun swirling in impossible hexagonal patterns. That's when the ships appeared. They materialized from within the geometric storm formations, massive vessels of gleaming metal and pulsing energy that dwarfed anything humans had ever built. Steele's training kicked in automatically as he documented everything, his mind calculating sizes, capabilities, and potential weaknesses, even as he struggled to process what he was seeing. Thunder 1, are you seeing this? Hayes's voice had returned, tight with controlled tension. Affirmative, Steele replied quietly, already moving. His original mission was now secondary. Gathering intelligence on these visitors took priority. Going dark. We'll observe and report. He'd barely taken 3 steps when his radio erupted with urgent transmissions from across the globe. Similar ships were appearing everywhere. New York, London, Beijing, Moscow. First contact was happening, and he was watching it unfold from a muddy jungle in Indonesia. The arms dealers had forgotten their weapons, staring skyward in awe. Steele used their distraction to slip closer, setting up an observation position with clear sightlines of both the camp and the alien vessel above. Years of Special Forces training had prepared him for almost anything. Except, perhaps, this. A beam of light shot down from the ship, and Steele's world exploded in a cascade of sensor readings. His tactical gear registered energy signatures off the charts, while his combat neural implant, standard issue for Special Forces operators, went haywire trying to analyze the unknown technology. Through the chaos, Steele remained perfectly still, controlling his breathing, heart rate steady. This discipline would later prove crucial, though he didn't know it yet. The light coalesced into 3 figures, tall, ethereal beings with crystalline armor that seemed to flow like liquid metal. They spoke in harmonics that made Steele's teeth ache until their translators kicked in. Another primitive military world. One said, its voice resonating with what seemed like disappointment, Class 3 at best, based on their scattered resistance forces. Steele almost smiled. They were scanning Earth's military capabilities, but they were missing something crucial. Special Forces operators like him were trained to be invisible, ghosts that could shift the tide of conflicts without ever being seen. The aliens' sophisticated technology was scanning for large armies, missile silos, and nuclear arsenals. They weren't looking for the small teams of highly trained operators who could do more damage than an entire battalion. Their first mistake. A commotion from the arms dealers' camp drew everyone's attention. One of them, panicked beyond reason, had raised his rifle at the aliens. Steele had less than a second to make a decision that would shape humanity's first contact. He moved. The night grew deeper as Steele stood at his hotel window, watching the crystalline ships hovering above Sydney Harbor. Their energy signatures pulsed in patterns he'd been analyzing since arrival. Every technology had its rhythm, its weaknesses. The Vraxians' greatest vulnerability was their certainty they had none. His neural implant hummed as it processed the day's observations. Standard protocol suggested rest before tomorrow's trials, but 2 decades of special operations had taught him the value of preparation over sleep. He pulled up the holographic display from his tactical pad, reviewing the limited footage of Vraxian combat demonstrations from other cities. A soft knock at his door broke his concentration. Through the security feed, he recognized Dr. Emily Reynolds, Earth's chief xenotechnology analyst. Her presence at this hour wasn't protocol, but then again, nothing about this situation was. "Come in," he called, engaging the room's privacy screens, a countermeasure against Vraxian surveillance he'd implemented hours ago. "Captain," Reynolds said, closing the door behind her. "Command sent me with some last-minute intel." She handed him a quantum-encrypted drive. "The Vraxians have been testing other military forces worldwide. The results aren't encouraging." Steele inserted the drive into his tactical pad. Footage played of Vraxian warriors decimating conventional military units in friendly competitions. Their liquid metal armor adapted to every weapon. Their energy weapons cut through every defense. But something caught his eye. "Pause. Enhance Sector 4, he commanded. The image zoomed in on a Vraxian warrior's armor during impact. There, the reaction time. Their tech isn't instantaneous. Reynolds leaned closer. "What are you seeing?" "Their armor adapts to threats it recognizes. Takes about 0.3 seconds. Steele's lips curved slightly. "That's an eternity in close combat. They're expecting you to fight like everyone else has. Head on, with standard tactics." Reynolds crossed her arms. "The Chinese sent their best special forces unit. Didn't even last 5 minutes." "The Chinese fight with technology trying to match the Vraxians," Steele replied, still studying the footage. "That's not how we're going to win this." Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "Captain, the brass just wants you to make a decent showing. Nobody expects victory." Steele turned to face her. "Doctor, do you know why the SAS and Delta Force maintain such high success rates, despite having inferior technology compared to our adversaries?" She shook her head. "Because we don't fight fair. We don't fight with honor. We fight to win." He pulled up another hologram, this one showing the Opera House's modified structure. The Vraxians chose that building for a reason. They're theatrical, need an audience. That's another weakness. Reynolds watched as he methodically marked entry points, blind spots, and structural vulnerabilities. "You're really planning to beat them?" "No," Steele said, his voice carrying the quiet certainty that had unnerved Zixtal earlier. "I'm planning to shatter their entire worldview." He pointed to a specific section of the building. "Their armor's power source. It has to be maintaining that liquid state somehow. Everything needs energy. And you think you can exploit that?" "I think," Steele said, pulling up the schematics for what looked like decidedly low-tech equipment, "that tomorrow they're going to learn why Earth's special forces are called force multipliers." Reynolds stared at the schematics, realization dawning. "That's brilliant and completely insane. Best kind of plan there is." Steele's neural implant pinged, warning of approaching Vraxian energy signatures. "You should go. They're doing another patrol." As Reynolds left, she paused at the door. "Captain, good hunting." Alone again, Steele returned to his preparations. Outside, the Vraxian ships continued their display of power, unaware that below them, a wolf was sharpening its teeth. Tomorrow would be interesting indeed. Dawn broke over Sydney Harbor, painting the Vraxian ships in gold and crimson. Inside the transformed Opera House, Captain Steele stood alone in the preparation chamber, wearing standard military PT gear while surrounding warriors donned their crystalline battle suits. The contrast was deliberate. Psychological warfare began before the first strike. "The initial trial is simple," Zixtal announced, his armor shifting to ceremonial patterns. "Pure combat efficiency. No weapons, no tactics. Merely strength against strength." The commander's faceplate rippled with what might have been amusement. Surely even primitives understand the basics of physical combat. Steel said nothing, memorizing how the alien armor responded to emotional shifts. Every flex, every ripple, told a story and revealed a weakness. The combat arena had been constructed in what was once the main concert hall. Gravity generators created a three-dimensional space where warriors could fight in any direction. The gathered audience, both human and alien, watched from protected observation bubbles. Steel's first opponent towered over him, armor pulsing with aggressive energy patterns. "I will try not to permanently damage Earth's champion." The Vraxian warrior broadcast on all frequencies. The alien spectators chittered what might have been laughter. "Begin," Zixtal commanded. The Vraxian launched forward with devastating speed, liquid metal limbs morphing into brutal striking surfaces. To the audience, Steel appeared to simply stand there, waiting for the impact. At the last possible moment, he shifted. Not much, just enough. The Vraxian's enhanced momentum carried him past his target. Steel's hand shot out, fingers finding the microscopic gap between armor plates he'd identified during his analysis. A precise neural pulse from his implant, transmitted through physical contact. The warrior's armor seized for a fraction of a second, its liquid state temporarily disrupted. Not enough to disable it, but enough to throw off its recovery sequence. The Vraxian stumbled, crashing into the gravity field's outer boundary. Silence fell over the arena. "Interesting," Steel said quietly. "Your armor responds to neural commands. Fast, efficient, and vulnerable to external input." The warrior roared, charging again. This time, Steel moved like water, each motion economical and precise. He didn't try to match the alien's strength. He simply redirected it, adding his own neural pulses at key moments. Each touch caused microscopic disruptions in the armor's flow. "Impossible," someone whispered from the observation bubbles. "He's fighting with their technology against them." But Steel wasn't fighting with technology. He was fighting with knowledge, with the understanding that even the most advanced systems had rhythms, had patterns. The Vraxian warrior's movements became increasingly erratic as his armor failed to respond correctly, its adaptive algorithms confused by the subtle neural interference. The end came suddenly. The warrior, frustrated by his inability to land a solid hit, committed to a full power strike. Steel stepped inside the attack, one hand finding the armor's primary neural junction point at the base of the skull. A focused pulse, stronger than the others. The liquid metal armor froze completely for 2 seconds. 2 seconds was an eternity in combat. When the armor rebooted, its wearer was on the ground, Steel's knee precisely positioned over the warrior's central neural cluster. In Vraxian combat culture, it was the ultimate position of defeat. "Submit," Steel said quietly. Not a demand, just a statement of fact. The warrior submitted. Zixtal's armor had shifted to a deep, midnight blue, a color Steel hadn't seen before. "You lost," the commander stated flatly. "No," Steel replied, helping his opponent up. "I studied. I adapted. I exploited." He turned to face the commander directly. "Isn't that what superior warriors are supposed to do?" The observation bubbles erupted in excited discussion. Human officials were frantically taking notes, while Vraxian nobles argued in their harmonic language. But Steel was already focusing on his next fight, his neural implant processing new data about their armor's vulnerabilities. He'd shown them humanity's capacity for adaptation. Now it was time to demonstrate why Earth's special forces were truly special. "Next round," Zixtal announced, his voice carrying an edge that wasn't there before. "Full combat simulation, with weapons." Steel allowed himself a small smile. Now the real games would begin. The weapons trial was scheduled for dusk, giving competitors 6 hours to prepare. Steel spent exactly none of that time with the advanced arsenal the Vraxians had generously provided. Instead, he sat in the Opera House's maintenance tunnels, surrounded by what the aliens had dismissed as primitive infrastructure. His neural implant interfaced with a crude tablet displaying the building's original schematics. Dr. Reynolds' voice came through his encrypted comm. They've activated their combat simulation grid. The whole building's hot with their tech now. Perfect, Steele replied, pulling a small device from his pocket. A simple USB drive that looked ancient compared to Vraxian technology. Their systems integrated with local infrastructure. Complete integration. They're using our power grid as a backup. Reynolds paused. Whatever you're planning, hurry. They're getting suspicious of your absence. Steele found what he was looking for. A maintenance terminal, unchanged since the building's construction. As advanced as the aliens were, they hadn't bothered to check such primitive access points. His first lesson in special forces. Sometimes the oldest path is the least guarded. The USB drive contained a hybrid virus, combining Earth coding with patterns observed in Vraxian systems. He plugged it in and waited. Upstairs, the gathered audience watched as Zixtol showcased their combat simulation technology. The concert hall had transformed into a sprawling urban warfare environment, complete with environmental effects and holographic civilians. Your champion appears to have fled, Zixtol announced to the human officials, his armor rippling with mock concern. Perhaps the challenge was too. The lights went out. When they returned a second later, the entire simulation had changed. Instead of an urban environment, they faced a dense jungle setting. Fog rolled across the ground as rain pattered on holographic leaves. Interesting choice. Steele's voice echoed through the chamber, but he was nowhere to be seen. But let's make this more realistic. The temperature dropped. Real moisture began condensing in the air. The Vraxian warriors' armor sensors started displaying conflicting data as actual environmental conditions merged with the simulation. Impossible, one of the alien technicians declared. He's modified the environmental controls through your own systems, Steele completed, his voice coming from everywhere and nowhere. You integrated with our infrastructure, but never bothered to check what was already there. 3 Vraxian warriors moved into combat formation, their armor struggling to adapt to the conflicting sensor data. They carried advanced energy weapons, each capable of vaporizing a tank. Show yourself, Zixtol commanded. Why? A primitive smoke grenade rolled into view, spewing thick clouds that played havoc with their armor's adaptive capabilities. Your weapons need a target. The first warrior fired at a movement, only to hit one of their own sensor arrays. The blast refracted through the modified environment, creating a cascade of false readings across their neural networks. You rely too much on your technology, Steele's voice continued as another warrior spun to fire at shadows. It makes you predictable. Something small and cylindrical landed at their feet. The warrior's armor instantly analyzed it. No explosives, no energy signature, just a simple metal tube. They ignored it. Their mistake. The tube split open, releasing a concentrated burst of electromagnetic interference patterned on their own armor's frequency. One warrior's liquid metal suit froze mid-motion, locked in and attempting to adapt to a signal it couldn't process. That's 2 mistakes, Steele said from somewhere in the chaos. Want to guess the third? The remaining warrior fired wildly, energy bolts cutting through the fog. Each shot provided brief illumination, revealing glimpses of the chamber's architecture, and a figure moving through impossible spaces between them. The third mistake, Steele's voice came from directly behind the warrior, is assuming superior technology means superior warfare. The warrior spun, firing at nothing. A simple rope, primitive hemp fibers that didn't register on advanced sensors, wrapped around armored legs. A quick pull, amplified by the warrior's own momentum. The crash echoed through the chamber. When the fog cleared, Steele stood in the center of the arena, surrounded by disabled warriors. In his hand, he held their commanding officer's ceremonial energy blade, plucked from Zixtol's own armor during the chaos. Sometimes, he said, offering the blade back to the commander, the most advanced weapon is the one they never see coming. The Vraxian High Command spent 3 days analyzing their combat simulation failure. 3 days of silence, during which Captain Steele waited patiently, knowing the psychological pressure of that silence would affect them more than any action. On the 4th morning, he found a message scratched into his hotel room mirror. Primitive luck. The aliens had finally made their first emotional mistake. They're rattled, Dr. Reynolds observed through his secure comm. Their warriors are demanding explanation for how their systems were compromised. Good, Steele replied, photographing the message. How's their sleep cycle? Barely resting. They've tripled their security protocols, checking every system for infiltration. A pause. The warriors assigned to guard you haven't slept at all. Steele allowed himself a small smile. Phase 2 could begin. He spent the day in plain sight, reading a paper book in the Opera House's public areas, Sun Tzu's Art of War. Every few hours, he'd make a small notation in the margins. The Vraxian guards watched him obsessively, their armor rippling with agitation every time he turned a page. At precisely 1500 hours, he closed the book and walked to the combat arena. The guards followed, weapons ready. Inside, he placed the book on the floor and left. It took their bomb disposal unit 2 hours to determine the book wasn't a threat. When they finally opened it, they found his notations weren't in English, but in their own mathematical language, complex equations describing their armor's vulnerabilities. Equations that shouldn't have been possible for a primitive to understand. That night, the guards outside his room heard him speaking in their harmonic language, perfectly replicating their command frequencies. When they burst in, they found only a small speaker playing recorded harmonics. Psychological warfare. Zixtal spat during an emergency meeting. Primitive intimidation tactics. Are they primitive if they're working? One of his subordinates asked, armor flickering with stress patterns. Our warriors are experiencing disturbances. Impossible, Zixtal declared. Our neural networks are designed to prevent such weakness. A junior warrior stepped forward, armor displaying erratic colors. Commander, we found this in the training arena. It was a piece of paper with a simple sketch, showing exactly how their neural networks could be overloaded using their own harmonics against them. The technical details were flawless. How? Zixtal demanded. How is he accessing this knowledge? Maybe, the junior warrior suggested, we should ask what else he knows. The next morning, Steele sat in the Opera House cafe, drinking coffee. Around him, Vraxian warriors maintained their guard positions, but their armor showed visible signs of stress. Micro-fluctuations in the liquid metal, harmonic frequencies slightly out of sync. Your warriors aren't sleeping well, he commented to Zixtal, who had finally come to confront him directly. What are you doing to them? The commander demanded. Steele took another sip of coffee. Teaching. Teaching what? Fear. He set down his cup. Your technology is remarkable. Your armor adapts to any physical threat. Your weapons can reshape matter itself. Another sip. But you never learned how to handle the one thing technology can't control: psychological uncertainty. Zixtal's armor rippled with rage. We are superior beings. We do not feel primitive emotions like fear. Then why are your hands shaking, Commander? The alien looked down. His liquid metal gauntlets were trembling slightly. How many of your warriors asked to be reassigned this morning? Steele continued. How many reported seeing shadows move in ways they couldn't explain? How many are questioning every system, every sensor reading, wondering what else they might have missed? Stop this, Zixtal ordered, but his voice carried an edge of uncertainty. I haven't done anything except show you what you refuse to see, Steele replied calmly. Humanity doesn't need superior technology to be dangerous. We mastered something far more powerful: the ability to instill doubt. He stood up, noting how the guards flinched slightly. Your next assessment test is scheduled for tomorrow. I look forward to seeing how your warriors perform, assuming any of them show up. As he walked away, he heard Zixtal's armor crackle with uncontrolled energy, the first public display of lost composure from a Vraxian commander in recorded history. Phase 2 was complete. Now for the real test. The attack came during pre-dawn hours, when Sydney's orbital defense grid suddenly went dark. Captain Steele was already awake, watching the Vraxian warriors patrol with their increasingly erratic patterns. His neural implant detected the power fluctuation seconds before the alarm sounded. Multiple hostile ships dropping out of FTL. Dr. Reynolds' voice crackled through his comm. They're not Vraxian. The sky lit up with plasma fire. Sleek, predatory vessels, nothing like the crystalline elegance of Vraxian ships, descended through the atmosphere. Their energy signatures were chaotic, unrefined. Pirates. Status of Vraxian Defense Fleet, Steele asked, already moving. Frozen. Their systems are locked up. Some kind of targeted virus. Reynolds paused. They can't even launch fighters. Steele reached the Opera House's command center in time to see Zixtal's armor cycling through emergency patterns. The commander was shouting in harmonics, trying to restore control to their systems. Their targeting grid is linked to ours, a technician reported. We can't disengage without a full system reset, which would take 4 hours, Zixtal snarled. By then, the orbital station will be lost, Steele finished. The massive structure above Sydney, half human, half Vraxian, housed thousands of civilians, along with everyone on it. The pirates' first salvo hit the station's outer ring. Emergency force fields flickered and held, but wouldn't last long. We have warriors ready to fight, Zixtal said, but without our targeting systems, without our neural links. Then we do this the human way. Steele pulled up a holographic map of Sydney Harbor. Dr. Reynolds, what ships are in the harbor right now? 3 passenger ferries, some private boats, 2 cargo vessels. Get me harbor control. Steele turned to Zixtal. Your warriors, can they fight without their neural assists? The commander's armor rippled with uncertainty. They've never had to. They're about to learn. Steele's neural implant connected with the harbor's primitive but functional control systems, because right now, those primitive systems are all we've got. The next 10 minutes were controlled chaos. Steele coordinated with local police while Zixtal gathered his warriors. The aliens struggled with simple radio communications, their reliance on neural networks suddenly a liability. The ferries, Steele explained, pointing to the harbor map. We can modify their hulls with reflective ice sheets. At the right angle, they'll appear as debris to orbital scans. Zixtal finished, his tactical training finally overriding his dependence on technology. But how do we fight? Steele opened a weapons case he prepared days ago. Inside were simple projectile weapons, modified with Vraxian power cells. Sometimes the old ways are best. The pirates deployed dropships, expecting an easy raid on a disabled target. What they found was a harbor full of seemingly abandoned vessels and zero resistance. Their first mistake. The abandoned ferry Steele commanded was practically invisible under its ice coating. His team, a mix of human police and Vraxian warriors still learning to trust their natural instincts over technological assists, waited in perfect silence. Remember, he whispered to the Vraxian beside him, you don't need neural links to be lethal. Trust your training. The nearest pirate ship passed directly overhead. Their sensors, calibrated for advanced energy signatures, missed the primitive threat below. Their second mistake. Now, Steele commanded. Modified harpoon guns, powered by Vraxian energy cells, fired simultaneously from multiple vessels. The magnetic grapples pierced the pirate's hull before they could raise shields. Pull, Steele ordered. The ferry's engines roared to life, their combined force yanking the pirate ship down to water level. The impact was spectacular. Boarding teams go. Human police and Vraxian warriors moved as one unit, using simple tactics that required no technological assistance. The pirates, expecting to face disabled Vraxian forces, found themselves overwhelmed by what appeared to be primitive savages fighting with impossible coordination. Their final mistake. As Steele led the charge onto the downed vessel, he caught Zixtal's expression through the commander's faceplate. something between shock and dawning respect. The real battle for the orbital station was about to begin. But now the Vraxians understood. Humanity's greatest weapon was never their technology. It was their ability to fight without it. The captured pirate vessel's bridge revealed the full scope of their crisis. Orbital defense platforms were failing systematically, and the main station's refugee section was critically overcrowded. On the tactical display, more hostile ships emerged from FTL. Their mothership, Captain Steele observed, studying the massive vessel that dwarfed even Vraxian cruisers. "That's our target." Zixtal's armor had finally stabilized, though he'd disabled its neural assistance systems. "Even with this ship, we cannot breach their defenses, not without our primary weapons." "Then we don't use weapons." Steele turned to the mixed group of human and Vraxian fighters. "We use deception." He laid out the plan using hand-drawn diagrams, no digital traces for the enemy to detect. The pirates had expected to find disabled Vraxian ships, and that's exactly what they would find. "It's insane," one of the Vraxian warriors said, but his armor rippled with interest rather than dismissal. "Insanity," Steele replied, "is doing the same thing and expecting different results. Right now, different is all we've got." They modified the captured ship's transponder using a technique that made Zixtal's armor pulse with disbelief. They programmed it using mechanical switches and primitive radio waves. "Your species," the commander noted, watching Steele work. "You prepare for everything to fail." "We prepare for success by embracing failure," Steele corrected. "Every defeat teaches survival." The plan was beautifully simple. The captured ship would approach the mothership, broadcasting captured Vraxian distress signals. Inside, human police officers wore salvaged pirate gear, while Vraxian warriors handled the ship's systems manually, their natural strength compensating for disabled automation. "Remember," Steele briefed the assault team, "no neural links, no energy signatures. Everything we do must look primitive and desperate." Dr. Reynolds' voice came through their jury-rigged comm system. "Station shields at 40%. Multiple hull breaches in civilian sectors." They had one shot. The mothership's hangar bay opened to receive their captured prize. Pirates expected to find more disabled Vraxian warriors to ransom. Instead, they found themselves facing opponents who fought like ghosts, appearing from impossible angles, using simple weapons in devastating ways. "Clear," Steele called out after the first engagement, watching with pride as humans and Vraxians moved in perfect sync. No neural networks, no battle computers, just trust and training. They fought their way to the ship's core, using tactics that would have seemed primitive to both pirates and Vraxians a week ago. Magnetic grapples became improvised ziplines. Emergency flares blinded advanced sensors. Physical keys and mechanical locks proved impossible for AI systems to hack. "The engine room's ahead," Zixtal reported, his armor stained with hydraulic fluid from hand-to-hand combat. "But their main force is waiting." Steele checked their remaining resources, a handful of modified weapons, some maintenance tools, and a crazy idea. "Perfect." He outlined the final assault using hand signals. The Vraxian warriors, who'd spent the past hour learning to fight without technological assistance, nodded in understanding. The pirates had sealed the engine room with energy shields and automated defenses. They expected a frontal assault from disabled Vraxian warriors. Instead, they got a maintenance drone, apparently damaged and drifting. When their systems scanned it, they found only primitive components. They didn't find the humans and Vraxians hiding inside its hollow shell, using the oldest trick in warfare's book. The Trojan horse worked as well in space as it had in ancient Troy. "Enemy systems disabled," Reynolds reported 20 minutes later. "Their virus is purged from our networks. Orbital station shields stabilizing." In the aftermath, as combined human Vraxian forces secured the mothership, Steele found Zixtal staring at a simple combat knife he'd used during the fight. "I never understood," the commander said quietly, "why your kind kept these primitive tools." "Because," Steele replied, helping a wounded Vraxian warrior to his feet, The most reliable weapon isn't the most advanced. It's the one that makes you part of something greater. The warrior's armor, still operating on manual control, shifted to a new color, one that matched his human comrade's uniform. They had become something unprecedented, warriors who combined the best of both worlds, who understood that true strength lay not in technology, but in the bonds forged through combat. The galaxy would never be the same. 2 weeks after the Battle of Sydney, the Galactic Council convened an emergency session. The chamber, usually dominated by displays of advanced technology, now held something unprecedented, a simple wooden podium behind which Captain Marcus Steele stood in his dress uniform. High Counselor Vertox's armor shifted through patterns of deep thought as she addressed the assembly. We gather to address a miscalculation, one that nearly cost us an orbital station and thousands of lives. The chamber's holographic displays showed footage from the battle, humans and Vraxians fighting together, primitive tools combining with advanced technology in ways that defied conventional military doctrine. Captain Steele, Vertox continued, "Your actions have forced us to reconsider our classification system. We had categorized Earth as a Class 3 primitive military world." Her armor rippled. "We were wrong." Steele remained silent, noting how the Vraxian warriors lining the chamber walls stood differently now. Their armor still gleamed, but many had added simple physical weapons to their arsenals. Some even carried versions of his modified tools. "Commander Zixtal," Vertox called, "present your findings." Zixtal stepped forward, his armor now bearing a unique pattern, a combination of Vraxian ceremonial markings and the simple lines of an SAS patch. "We propose a new classification," he announced. "Apex Adaptives, a species that turns perceived weakness into unprecedented strength." He gestured to Steele. "They do not merely use technology. They understand its limitations. They do not simply fight. They redefine warfare itself." The chamber erupted in harmonic discussions. Steele caught Dr. Reynolds' eye from her position among the human delegation. She smiled slightly. They'd come a long way from that late-night planning session in his hotel room. "There is more," Zixtal continued. "I am establishing a new training protocol for our warriors, one that combines our advanced systems with what humans call back-to-basics training." His armor displayed footage of Vraxian warriors learning to fight without neural assists. "Captain Steele has agreed to oversee this program." This announcement caused even more commotion. A Vraxian commander, accepting guidance from a primitive species, unprecedented. "If I may," Steele finally spoke, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had first unnerved the Vraxians. "Your technology is remarkable. Your warriors are brave. But the greatest weapon isn't the most advanced." He paused, making eye contact with various council members. "It's the one that works when everything else fails." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple combat knife, the same one Zixtal had contemplated after the battle. "This blade is centuries old in design, primitive by your standards. But in the right hands, with the right training, it can overcome any technological advantage." "Because it cannot be hacked," one council member observed. "Because it forces you to be better," Steele corrected. "To think, to adapt, to overcome. Technology should enhance these qualities, not replace them." Vertox's armor shifted to a new pattern, one of deep blue shot through with gold, a color scheme that matched human dress uniforms. "The Council recognizes Earth's unique contribution to galactic security. We offer not merely alliance, but partnership." She gestured, and the chamber's displays showed new construction at military academies across the galaxy, training grounds that combined advanced technology with primitive terrain, weapon ranges where energy rifles sapped aside simple projectile weapons. "The first class of the Combined Warfare Academy begins next month," Zixtal announced. "Already, warriors from 12 species have enrolled, eager to learn what humans call Special Forces methodology." Steele nodded, thinking of the lessons ahead. Teaching aliens to move silently, to think creatively, to fight with both technology and instinct. It would be challenging, But that was the point. In pushing their limits, both species would grow stronger. There is an old human saying, he told the council, the more you sweat in training, the less you bleed in battle. He smiled slightly. I look forward to seeing everyone sweat. As the council session concluded, Steele saw Vraxian warriors discussing tactics with human officers, their armor displaying new patterns that spoke of respect earned rather than superiority assumed. They had not merely survived first contact. They had transformed it. And somewhere in the galaxy, potential adversaries were about to learn a vital lesson. Never underestimate a species that turns primitive into powerful. The real training was about to begin.